Great. Thanks for including our paper on this program. I need a clicker. All right, thank you. So this paper is joined with Peter, who is sitting here. It's about leverage dynamics. So we started thinking about this problem. In some sense, it's just dissatisfied with the current state of the literature. And in our mind, that the leverage dynamics is at the heart of the dynamic corporate finance. And oftentimes, that a lot of intuitions that we got from the static trade-off, which is maximizing the firm value, could be very different from the equity holders' dynamic optimization. And we will show you that that is indeed true. It's also kind of challenging that perhaps that's why that for a while that we haven't got too much progress at it. Is it because when you think about this problem, when the firms are issuing debt along the way, and imagine that it's going to moving around under some equilibrium conditions, and then the debt price has to conjecture what the equity holders or the firm owners will do, and these two policies are going to interact with each other. Right? So that's really the challenging part. And in the existing literature, there's some ways to deal with this type of a problem, but oftentimes is rely on some ad hoc commitment of future debt policies, and more or less I'm also contributing to that part of the literature, and I just take that as a given, just move on. For instance, let me just explain to you. One is this Leland 94 and also Leland 98, if you were familiar with this literature. It's just having the assumption saying that from the beginning, we are focusing in a financing policy where you keep refinancing at a particular rule so that it keep the outstanding debt face value constant, even though the fundamental is moving around. Okay, so that's one thing. And often the time that they try to accommodate the fact that sometimes leverage could change according to the history. So often the time they will say, okay, whenever it adjusts debt, then the firm has to retire the existing debt. Once you retire, then you're basically facing a clean plate, and then you just re-optimize again. So that's the usual trick to make it work. But oftentimes you would think about it that once you have these type of transaction costs, it will get to the equilibrium behavior, like a very abrupt adjustment of leverage. That once you move to that point, you jump to that point, and then you're coming back or wandering around, and then you readjust again. And that is empirically counterfactual. If you look at the data, you see that firms are actively managing their debt, and oftentimes is incrementally. So here's one picture that is the only data showing up in our paper. We picked the two airline companies, not because that they're great companies. Both of them actually went to default. That's why we picked them at some point. So this is this point. American Airlines went to a default, and here is also United Airlines went to default. Well, the point of this picture is just really just showing you that when the fundamental here is we just using the so-called TEV, that's total enterprise value. It's a book debt plus the market equity plotting here. So kind of just telling you that there's some movement of the fundamental, and here showing you the book debt, aggregated book debt, adding up all the debt obligations together. You see that it's moving around. So this is just telling you that we are analyzing some relevant questions, and then this is the paper will do. Okay. In the paper, I'm going to start with saying that the firm, we assuming they cannot commit to any future debt policies. Otherwise, it's very standard, just all the ingredients that you might know, and these two, basically. One is that you might go to the default, and when bankruptcy happens, nobody get anything. Okay, so there's a cost on that. And then you have a tax shield. That's why the firms are issuing debt. We're assuming no commitment at all, okay? For instance, there's no covenants. Obviously, including relevant covenants in the analysis is going to be very interesting direction of future research, but we are not doing it here. We are thinking that it's a more endogenous friction in our mind, right? We know what will happen in the first best, but we are trying to think about what will happen if you have a friction. Our friction is kind of like endogenous because it's just saying that you cannot commit. There's no court to enforce all these things. rather than exogenous frictions to adjust the leverage. That's what happened. That's what the current ledger do. So let me be upfront, just telling you that what's the assumption on seniority and the dilution, because that's the first order thing that when we try to analyze this exercise. In the main analysis, that I'm explaining to you, it has a zero recovery. What does it mean? Just basically means that when the equity declares bankruptcy, okay, there's nothing left, okay? So there's no seniority issue, because the seniority is, if a legal definition of seniority only happens in the bankruptcy stage where you do have something opening up. So why we emphasize that, just telling you that our analysis really has nothing to do with the seniority structure. We do have this so-called indirect dilution, which is a very important, showing up in many, many different occasions, in the sense that when the firm later on issuing more debt, not because I'm directly dilute the existing debt holder. It's because when I issue more debt, the firm will default earlier, and that hurts the profitability or the valuation of the current debt. So that's another form of a dilution, but it's less direct than here. We also analyze the situation where you do have a positive recovery, and then we say that, okay, given that, let's assuming the parent pursue that, so you do have a very strong direct dilution force there. I'm not presenting in here, but we do have a pretty clean characterization on what will happen at that point. Okay, so this is one of the results that is showing up in this analysis is that the leverage may go down via debt asset growth. So when the fundamental go up, obviously the leverage is going to go down, right? Leverage is defined as the debt over asset. And also debt maturing, because then you cut the debt. But equity never reduced debt voluntarily. So in the equilibrium, it's a very canonical setting that we found that you do have this trade-off, but the equity holders or the firms who is maximizing the exposed value of the equity value will never issue debt voluntarily. This is it's almost identical inside of the leverage ratchet effect. I'm just, if this is the only thing about the insider, then I just tell you that our setting is more canonical, so you will see that how general this force is. What we are really the contribution of the paper is that we have a general method to solve the sample model. So you will see that what's the trick that is going behind it.
Can you just don't cross this?
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're in jail.
I suppose not to move, I guess. Okay. Okay. So it's a result of reminiscent of a Coase conjecture, where Coase conjecture basically saying that a firm who cannot commit to his future self in competing on some product, goods, or the things that when we take the time limit to dt, which is a continuous time, you're competing against yourself so much that you don't gain anything from that you might gain from the setting where you could commit yourself on future doing. So here, what we will show is that in the equilibrium, because of the equity holder or firm cannot commit to the future debt policy, he competes against himself so much that he actually didn't gain anything from the debt shield. Okay? And you might ask that in equilibrium, he does issue a lot, so where does all these debt shield going to? It goes to these bankruptcy costs, that because if he issue a lot, default is going to be faster, therefore these two gain, benefit, cost just cancel each other. Okay. So that's the first result on what's going on. We have a closed form solutions for everything if we focus on the log normal. And we have a very reasonable, empirically relevant history, leverage dynamics. It's basically history dependent in the sense that it issue more when the firm fundamental goes up, but not that much that it exactly match the leverage. But then when you have a bad shocks, then you just scale down. So kind of like a little bit a precautionary kind of a policy. So therefore, a leverage dynamic tend to be mean reverting because of this adjustment. And I really wanted to tell you one thing is that our results of a dynamic trade-off is so different from a static trade-off of the firm value. For instance, we will have a situation where we have a true leverage and the maturity dynamics drastically different from each other. So I will show you two parts. One is that a firm has a shortened debt, let's say one day or 1 year, kind of bank, financial institution, or other things, or other firms have a 10 years of bond, let's say 20. 10 to 20, and their evolution are very different. However, both are optimal in the ex-ante perspective. So in a way that it's the reminiscent of this Lamont, Roberts, Zender, what they show is that in practice, in the data, when you're seeing all these firms' leverage policies, there's a lot of variation, cross-sectional variation cannot be explained by the fundamental variables that we usually coming up in the static models, for instance, like profitability, blah, 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 all these things. It seems we can explain that part just because there's a lot of randomness in the beginning on picking one versus the other, and these equity orders actually are indifferent. So without further ado, let me just explain to you the model. My plan going to be tell you the general model first, and showing you that there's some ways to deal with getting the solution. Then the second is that I'm going to apply this apparatus to the standard Leland type of like a geometry Brownian motion log-normal process, and showing you all the things in the closed form. And also that recently we had some progress in showing some equilibrium property for this, a little bit technical person who is interested in, what kind of this dynamic game, that what kind of things we can say about the uniqueness of a result and all these things. I will explain to you going along the time that I think that it's useful for you to understand what's really general, what's not. Okay, so we have a preference of a risk-neutral world with a common discount rate R, so both are same impatience. Assets, it's quite general. What we could do also adding some jumps, but for this presentation, we are not doing that. Focus on zero recovery now, so there's no issue of seniority. That's important. Debt contract is the standard contract where you have this each debt with a coupon rate C, face value 1, and exponentially retiring. Okay, so that's the for the tractability issue. And the rate of C, that's really capturing the maturity of the debt. So 1 over C is basically the average maturity. Okay. What I'm going to really emphasize is that the aggregated face value FT will be endogenous because the equity holders at any point of time can decide how much debt to issue. Okay, but they're issuing the same debt. Corporate tax is a pi as a function of a YT minus CFT. So this is the pi is a function. You can also think about it as just a pi a parameter times that. That's all fine. Okay, for this particular case is the general. So let me just put that way. Okay, the evolution of debt policy look like that. So the equity holders, okay, who's in charge of all the daily operations, they're gonna decide to sell or buy back debt, D gamma T. Okay, that's endogenous. So in aggregate for the firm, the total debt outstanding face value look like this. First of all, over time, for the next period, there's a contractual debt maturing that you need to pay. Okay, if you don't pay, that means your default gone, right? But once you pay that, then you're allowed to continue, and then you just decide how much debt to buy back or issue more. D gamma T could be positive or negative, which means that you buy back or issue. The timing within T and the T plus DT is follows, and we basically built in a interim commitment, okay? And then we let the commitment ability shrink to 0. And it's important to think about the timing so that everything becomes rigorous. Cash flow realizes first. After seeing the shock, I decide to default. If you're not default, I'm paying the coupon and principal. And then you say that, okay, fine, I want to add more debt, how much that? Or you want to buy back debt, how much that? Okay, announce it to the market. And then price will set based on that announcement. And then you trade, and then your next period, you're going to come again. Okay, great. So within the period, there's no shock, right? just that each. You cannot commit to the future debt policy. Okay, you can commit a little bit, right? It's just, but that's like shrinking. We're going to focusing on the so-called smooth equilibrium. Okay. What do we mean by focusing on? We're just looking for equilibrium belong to that class, which says that d gamma t equals gt times dt. So each period, the debt that adding on or buyback is very small proportional to the time period that we are talking about. Equity, within the equilibrium, of course, you are free to add on more debt than the dt order, but in equilibrium, it's not optimal to do so. Okay, that's the equilibrium class that we are focusing on. Obviously, you might think that, okay, what if that we are thinking about other equilibria with jumps, okay? And then the answer is in general, yes, but there are some ways that we can focusing on some kind of equilibrium and show uniqueness. Okay. So equity, you're going to default at the endogenous stopping time tau b because that here has the option to default at any point in time. Right. The state variable in our model going to be the exogenous cash flow YT and the endogenous debt obligation at FT. And for this line, it's very well known. It's cash flows. This is the equity receivable cash flow, and the corporate tax, and the interest principal, and the issuance repurchase, right? Positive and negative, it's all fine. PT going to determine it later because that's the equilibrium object. And equity is basically solving two things. I'm choosing how much debt to issue and when to stop, and given the price that offered by the market. That's it. All right. So that's the basic problem. And here, this slide is just telling you that in equilibrium, debt has to be rational, so competitive versus neutral, that investor price debt rationally, so you get all this. This is the standard way of putting it down. Why does commitment matter? So in this problem, clearly is because of the default timing. And the default timing depending on the firm's issuance policy. So PT depends on equilibrium default of tau b, and that just has this interaction which makes the problem quite interesting. Okay, so let me just telling you that how do we attack this problem. Obviously, that a smooth equilibrium helps. That's why we're focusing on this part of equilibrium. Let me write down the HJB equation of the value of the equity holder. So basically, HJB equation just showing you that how much the required return that any equity holder would do. So it's RV equals the flow payoff that you gain. Ignore all these parts. This is the standard stuff from the literature. What's new here is really that I care about how much I'm issue repurchase given the price. Right? If I issue more, then this is a gain. And then, obviously, if you're adding on a little bit more debt, I understand that later on I might default earlier. So there's an impact of my future value function by adding on a little bit of the debt. So that's the future penalty on that. And here is the evolution of debt, just because when I'm adding on, there's a G minus KCF. So that's the problem that the equity holder is solving. And the objective is linear in G, which means that first order condition has to hold, which means that actually the marginal benefit of issuance and the marginal cost of a future value has to be equal if that in equilibrium is optimal in issuing that amount of debt. Right. This implies that this is also standard in this linear control problem, where is under FOC, the equity going to be indifferent at any G. So it's like that if you have firm that you can facing a linear problem that you have to gain zero profits. That's related to that result. As a result, that in here, if I only care about the value function V, then I can say that okay, fine, that even though equilibrium you are taking is G star, I'm going to solve later, but you can solve the value function itself by setting G equals 0, so that's what we do. That's basically the results that help us to get that. And why this is the key, I want to say two things. One is that no gain in equilibrium by debt issuance. So Repurchase already explained it to you. That's related to the cost conjecture. In the end, that this guy is competing himself so hard that equilibrium has to be the case doesn't get anything. And the tax shield, again, is dissipated by the bankruptcy. The second thing is that it's interesting that we get the value function of equity without knowing that price, because that I can solve the value function by not issuing. So therefore, the price does not matter. OK, good. Great. Then I'm going to explain to you the how do we figure out the G function. Figure out how much that the equity holder is issuing. So we have a debt price. Think about it, is that the value function of V gonna gives our P function, right? Because that's a first order condition. And here is the debt holder's valuation equation. Okay, so what's the difference between these two? One is that the ODE for V does not depending on the G, because as I said, we figure out the V by setting G equals 0 already. However, that obviously from the debt holder's perspective, the moment I'm calculating the price I'm willing to pay, depending on my conjecture of your future policy. Okay, so therefore that combining these two together, just matching these two approach, what we get is an equilibrium debt assurance policy, which has a very, very nice intuition that it turns out that exactly identical to the following strict discrete time. So let me just explain a little bit of discrete time. So discrete time is that within a period, the equity holder is thinking about, okay, if I'm issuing a little bit of the delta issuance, what I gain is that I'm getting the tax benefit of delta C, then times the H time interval. And then, obviously, I'm issuing more debt, get the new debt proceeds. Right? And then here, I have the future equity value. Okay? And then you just figure out the first order condition, you realize is that, OK, I have the delta equals the tax benefit. And the later part is just saying that when I issue more debt, a little bit more debt, I'm getting a price impact on the price function. So basically, I have a benefit there, and then the price impact, then the optimal debt that I'm issuing is actually equals this. So this is exactly matched with the. So another thing that is really important for us to check is that we said that you can focus on this continuous smooth policy, but we have to make sure that it's not optimal to jump to other parts. And this intuition is really related to this convexity so here's a proposition. Just says that global optimality holds if the debt price is non-increasing in debt F. Okay, if I show that the price function implied by this method is actually decreasing in F, which means that the higher the F, fixing everything else, the price is higher, the price is lower, then we are fine. Why this is the case? Just because thinking about it, this is related to this point that the equity value typically is convex, because that the equity value function is convex in F because of the option value of default. If I'm here, if I'm trying to get in here, which means that when I issue this delta amount of debt, the price I'm getting is at this point. And at that point, the price is really low. On the opposite, if I want to buy back, which means that I will jump to here, the price will be set after the announcement, and that price will go against me. So that's basically the key intuition why. So, let me just tell you that the leverage ratchet effect, I will just go very quickly, that what is the impact of debt repurchase on equity value? So in our model, we show that it is always optimal to issue debt. Often the time, the intuition is saying that you might want to repurchase back because it's optimal for the firm value. However, that in this model, never. This is really because that it is indeed true that it makes the firm value better, but it's not at all benefit to the current equity holder, okay? And what we can show is that because the equity holder at any point of time, knowing that he already optimized everything, the fact that I'm reducing debt burden a little bit doesn't help me anything on all the future policy I'm making. However, the debt tax benefit is real. So every single time, it's just jumping at the point that they try to collect a little bit of that tax shield, and then just adding on more and Okay, great. So we have this log normal cash flow model. What we're going to show is that in the end, we have a one-dimensional state variable, yt, going to be equals yt over ft. This is a strong Markov property that we are using. Under the strong Markov property, what we can show is indeed everything becomes unique. So that's the new results that we would do. And in this model, then what we have is that in equilibrium, the evolution of a state variable, which is basically scaled cash flow, going to have this exogenous part, exogenous debt maturing, but then you have a debt issuance. Then later on, next 2 slides, I will emphasize the debt issuance to you. Okay, so this is the net debt issuance will look like. This just says that if things are good, like here, then the company will issue a lot of debt, okay, so that on average the leverage is going up. Okay, just to try to catch the good shocks. On the low side is that after a series of bad shocks, then the equity holders will issue less debt, so much so that they're actually lower than the debt maturing speed, so that it's just become the mean spread. Okay, great. I'm going to skip this too. And what we can also show is this equilibrium debt dynamics is that we can capitalize the entire path of the equilibrium, which is basically saying that at any point of time, the firm's debt is basically a summation of a past realization of these cash flows. And there's a lot of analysis that we can do is about how fast is the mean spread, mean preserving spread of the leverage. It's really dependent on the short-term debt. If the debt is a shortener, then that just means that at any point of time after the good shock, then the firms will be able to issue more debt so that it just become more sensitive to the fundamentals. The last theoretical point I want to point out is that optimal debt maturity structure is not the focus of our model, but we do offer very deep analysis on that, is that so far we choose the KC as a parameter. However, let's say that the firm gets a one-time chance to set KC optimally for future debt, because it's a bad idea to say that I'm going to change the already existing debt. Right? The proposition said the equity holder will be indifferent. Okay, will be. The reason is obvious. Given that equity holders is indifferent and any issuing strategy, why would I care about the new debt issuance maturity? So this indifference results really holds more generally. This leads to almost the last second slides is showing you that, okay, what if that we have two firms to have initially, because they were indifferent, but somehow that a small change of the preference leads one firm to issue short-term debt, the other firm to issue long-term debt. Okay, so this is really tells us something about the Lemon-Roberts-Zeno model. So here is a long-term debt guy. Long-term debt guy will be very less aggressive in issuing debt. So this is the debt. And here is the debt over TEV, so that's the leverage. While here I'm showing you is actually a short-term debt guy. Short-term debt guy will immediately issue a lot, and then actually making sure that his leverage ratio keep at a very high level. Okay, so these two companies actually are essentially they are indifferent, but that you see that these two paths are completely optimal from that perspective. Okay. Okay, good. So this is the conclusion. What we have done is, I hope that I already told you the methodology and some canonical analysis for some model. The future extension, Peter had an AFA presidential address, is using this type of model, saying that it's extremely important to think about collateralized lending, because collateralized lending really puts exclusivity on the debt that you can issue. Right? For us, we don't have the collateralizer, therefore you can keep issuing. Then we have another follow-on paper on modeling the summary data. The default to us, it's really exactly same set of issue. And it's interesting to think about internal cash with a liquidity-driven default because, this is a common critique to this Leland type of model. And in here that I think that in the future there will be a lot of interesting stuff going on this and combined with some covenant.
Thank you
Good.
very much.